Today's training topic is just for all of you preachers out there. And I want to talk about how to preach without notes. Now, I'm not saying that you have to preach without notes. I'm not saying that it's better to preach without notes. Most seminaries teach you how to prep a message and then preach with your notes. But in my observation, this is my observation, some of the best preachers out there can do it without being so tied to their notes. And in my experience, years of preaching, more than 2 decades of preaching, I've noticed in my own life that I've gotten better at preaching without notes. It helps me stay connected. It helps me stay present, but it takes a little practice. And so I've got 4 tips for you today on how to do just that. Now, I think it starts with getting a solid outline. For me, when I preach, you can even just take a look at this, this topic right here. This could be an outline for a sermon if I wanted to, if I was preaching to a bunch of preachers. But I think you start with a solid outline that is clear, that's concise, that's compelling, that works together. If you want to check out some of our resources at PursueGOD.org, that's how we write all of our topics at Pursue God. Simple talking points, those are like outline points. And I think it really makes a difference if you put in the time to get an outline that makes sense, that's well connected, that's supported, that's coming straight from Scripture, that's Christ-centered, all that stuff. So the first step, get a solid outline. Now, next, I would encourage you as a preacher to explain it conversationally. And here's what I mean by that. Imagine as you're preaching, don't imagine that your seminary professors in the crowd. Don't think about the smartest guy in your church. Don't think about your overseers or your elders in the crowd. What I like to do is I like to think about just a regular guy. I like to think about a family with teenagers or with kids. I like to think about parents. I like to think about married couples. I like to think about a young man, a college student. And when you get those people in your mind, just imagine, as you take that outline, imagine that you're just explaining each one of those points in your outline, just in a simple conversation. So one of the simplest ways to do that is just have the conversation before you preach. And pay attention to how it comes across when you're just having a conversation. You don't change your tone of voice. You don't use all this inflection. You're not acting. You're not presenting. You're not trying to, be the Bible answer man. You're putting yourself in the shoes of another person, the person that you're talking to. You're taking that point, and eventually all of those points, and you're explaining it with a conversational tone where it makes sense to the person that you're talking to. So that means you're using illustrations. You're explaining the passage maybe in Scripture for that point. You're explaining it in a conversational, simple conversational tone. So explain it conversationally. I think it'll make it a lot easier. If you think of it as this high pressure thing, I've got to preach this sermon and it's super official and formal. Well, I think that you're setting yourself up for failure. I encourage you to think about it as a simple conversation. Now, technically, it's not a conversation, right? It's a monologue, but it can come across like a conversation if that's how you think about it. Now, here's my third tip, and I just say circle back. And this is really coming back to the way that you outline the whole thing in the first place. I've got my 3 or 4 points that I'm using as my skeleton, as my framework for my message, but I want to make sure to circle back to how I hook them in the beginning. So when you're thinking about the overall message, one of the things that I do at the very end, before I preach it, at the very end of my prep, is I think about, okay, here are the main points I want to preach. So how do I get into the sermon? Like, what is the mechanism? What is the hook that I'm going to use to get into the sermon, whatever it is? And then to make sure, as often as possible, to circle back to that hook after I've preached all of those points. If you think about it, this is how good movies go, or this is how, really good books work. Good chapters in books work. You start with the hook, you set it up, and then eventually you bring it back, you tie it all up so that it makes sense, and so the people who are listening are being brought back to the thing that got them interested in the sermon in the first place. So if you want to preach without notes, really learn to keep those outline points clear and hook them and then circle back to the hook. Now, the last thing I would encourage you to do is to practice. If you're new at this, I would challenge a new preacher to practice preaching conversationally, practice preaching, maybe not without notes altogether, but just practice preaching with an outline rather than a full manuscript that you have to memorize or read. Now, for those of you who have preached for a long time and you're just used to the notes, you're used to the manuscript, it might actually be a little bit harder for you to preach like this because you're not used to it. So it really does make sense that you have to, if you want to preach without notes, you have to practice doing it. Now, again, in my life, I feel like it is so worth it to learn how to preach without notes because, again, I'm going to circle back to what I said at the beginning. When I do it, it allows me to be more present. It allows me to connect with the crowd, have more ethos as I preach. So my recommendation, learn to preach without your notes.